Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Unit 3, Topic 2. It's time to talk about UN spots, for which I should have had a different background here. Spots all over the slide, or maybe I should have been wearing some sort of leopard print shirt, or it been hanging behind me to talk about UN spots. Or I could have put spots all over my face. It would have been more fun than this. I apologize to you. I'll do better next time. UN spots is a conversation about how regions get amplified at the UN through allocation of spots on certain committees. So that should make sense as we go through, but might not make sense right now. But it becomes one of the main points of contention at the UN also is what sort of access do different regions have to different bodies at the United Nations. So here we go. So you may recognize this slide, or this image at least, from earlier in the semester, where we're looking at the breadth of the UN system. In this case, this is everything that goes past the principal organs. So as you recall, on the left-hand side, you have the six main organs, the principal organs of the United Nations. The General Assembly, to which every country in the UN belongs. The Security Council, which has a subset. The Economic and Social Council, which has a subset. The Secretariat, which is the professional body of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice, which hears cases between member states but are not really staffed by member states. And the Trusteeship Council, which is currently defunct. So really the only one on the left, which is has the presence of all member states, is the General Assembly. So there's 193 member states. All of them belong to the General Assembly in an equal fashion. But once you go to subsets, then you have to figure out how do you get that subset. So here from the Charter is the specific place where it's referenced, and then the principle at which all the other conversations about subsets are generated. So this is Chapter 5, Article 23 of the Charter, which is talking about membership of the Security Council. So it lays out, first and foremost, the 5 permanent members: the Republic of China, which has since been changed to the People's Republic of China; France, the USSR, which has since been changed to Russia; the United Kingdom, and the United States. These are the permanent members of the Security Council. So the General Assembly then gets to elect 10 other members to be there. They're the non-permanent members. And so you're looking at their contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security, but it doesn't tell you how that will go. But also, and here's the key, to equitable geographical distribution. So one of the main things that people complain about when they complain about the way the Security Council works is that if you look at that permanent 5, there's precious little diversity there. You remember there's precious little diversity because those 5 states were concerned about the other states sort of cajoling them into war. So you have the bigger, powerful states from 1945 securing a privileged position for themselves and or their allies in places where they want a buffer state. So if you're concerned about the rise of Japan, make sure China's present there. But that means that the United Kingdom, France, and the United States are all essentially they're allies, and the United States gets put in a group I'll tell you about in a minute called WEOG, which is the West Europe and other groups. You have 3 very similar looking states, and if you add how many are European states, then you have 3 plus the United States, which some people would argue is a 4th, and that's not a fair balance. But the rest is supposed to have equitable geographical distribution. So what that means in practice in the Security Council is this. So I mentioned before when we looked at the UN and the Cold War that the only region that's been subdivided is Europe, and that's a holdover of the Cold War, where the then Soviets argued that they could never expect to have their allies put onto a committee where Europe was lumped together, that there would just be more of West Europe than there were of them. So you end up with 1 Eastern European country always on the Security Council, 2 West Europe and other, so they're called WEOG. I'll tell you about that in a minute. 2 from the Americas, that's Latin America and the Caribbean, and then 5 from Asia, Africa, which defaults basically to 2 from Asia because China is also there, so that makes 3 Asian states, and 3 from Africa. So even though it's 5, it's usually 2/3, though it can become 3/2. So West Europe and other is designed for it currently operates on behalf of 5 states that are not physically in West Europe, but are added to that group because their economy, their politics, their society, etc., looks and acts a certain way, which makes them less likely to be able to represent their region, their home region, than if they were with West Europe. So the United States, as you know, is one of those. So the United States is called Other. They're West Europe and Other Group, or WEOG. And the rationale there is that the United States acts more like a West European country, like France, like Italy, like Germany, like Switzerland than it does act like Nicaragua or Chile or Bolivia. You may agree or disagree with that, but that's the feeling. In that, if you're elected on this basis of geographical distribution, that the presence will be from an individual member state who will act on its own behalf, but perhaps also act in some sort of consort with or representation of the region to which they belong. So the other WEOG states, in addition to the United States, are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel, all of which are perceived to act more like West Europe than they do like their region. So you have 5 of these elected to a 2-year term on this idea of equitable geographical distribution. Where it gets dicey at the Security Council is that states complain about what that looks like on the permanent states. And so when you talk about expanding the Security Council and whether 15 is enough, that maybe there should be 18 or 20 or 25 or 30 or more, that paying attention to equitable geographical distribution should pertain to the permanent seats as well, which really means that you've got no ability to discuss things about Security Council reform because you've thrown too many variables into the mix. It's easier to talk about equitable geographic distribution in the other bodies. So let's go back to this thing. We just looked at what this means, but what we need to look at also is what this means. The specialized agencies, the subsidiary bodies, the programs and funds in particular, all of which are managed day to day by the Secretariat, the representatives of the Secretariat who are there, but for whose decision-making processes those fall to a subset of states out of the General Assembly. So the General Assembly has a big role in some places in electing those. For example, here, again, back to this part from the UN Charter, it's the General Assembly who elects the 10 other members of the United Nations to be there. But not all of these states these organizations are considered to fall under the General Assembly. A lot are here under the Economic and Social Council, and some of the sub-agencies are considered to be under or related enough to another committee, commission, agency, program, or fund that they get a say as well. So I know that sounds really confusing, so let's look at this list to get a sense of what that means. So let's look at the World Food Program, for example. Instead of being elected, the 36 members of the WFP Executive Committee, those are member states, being all elected from ECOSOC or the General Assembly, 18 are elected by ECOSOC and 18 are elected by the Food and Agricultural Organization. So the FAO existed first. It used to have encompass the same mandate that the WFP has. Food and Agriculture Organization essentially works on projects long-term in nature, trying to help develop sustainable agriculture and food systems in a country, whereas the World Food Program responds to food emergencies. That used to all be embedded in the FAO, but it was too big a mandate and it became hard to choose between the two parts of the mandate on how to spend funds. So you split them off, but you still give the FAO say in how that works. So the FAO, which has all member states in it, gets to elect 18 members of the WFP. So you'll have these different processes. If an organization is directly under ECOSOC, then you're elected from ECOSOC. If it's mixed, then it's mixed. So ECOSOC, though, is elected by the General Assembly. So somehow always comes back to the GA in some way. And states decide which of these bodies they aspire to and begin an arc in which they're going to try and, through a whole series of deal making and exchanges of favors and of influence, are going to try and stand for election on the committees that mean the most to them. So what happens here, let's go back to this one. This is the non-permanent seats in the Security Council. They're voted on by the General Assembly. If they do their job right, if these states do their job right, then when it comes time for the General Assembly to vote, they only put up as many seats as there are spots. In other words, if West Europe and other, they get one spot each year. Okay, so it's a stagger, right? So 5 new ones come on each year. If you put forward one country, if you agree internally who that country is going to be, then the General Assembly basically rubber stamps what you want. But if you don't do your due diligence internally and put forward only one candidate, then the GA has some power. The other states in the world have some power to decide who you'd like to be. And oftentimes in the Americas, you can run up into problems where, so 2 years ago, Venezuela was up for election. They've just been elected recently. And Panama was up for election at the same time, even though there was only one seat. So that gave the power over to the General Assembly, and they couldn't come to a decision either, so there had to be a third candidate agreed upon. It was really quite complicated. But basically, there's that. So the way you get to those decisions is you have a 10-year arc, roughly, where states will say, hey, my country is going to campaign for the Security Council. We looked at Estonia trying to do 2020. Estonia sits in that WEOG group. So they're going to try and come forward in 2020. That means that other states will say, okay, we'll support you, but we want to be on the Economic and Social Council, and we want to be on UNICEF this year and this year, right? So they'll set out those things, and Estonia has to keep track of votes, promises, favors owed, etc., across the whole body. One that gets really confusing in the United States, the one of these that really comes to the fore, we read about in our press Security Council elections, but the one we read about most often are elections to the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council is one where we get bugged. We get bugged a lot when states get elected to the Human Rights Council who we judge as being terrible stewards of human rights. And that does happen. And the reason it happens is because regionally they negotiate for those spots so that they can get on there because they may prioritize their own ability to be present, either to argue that they're better than they're being made out to be, or so they can guard against the worst condemnations that might come forward, or just to have something at the UN that's called the right of rebuttal, where if your country is directly attacked, rightly or wrongly, in debate, that if you're present in a meeting, if you're a member of a committee, you can have a right of response. So you may just want to be there to have the right of response when they say, Saudi Arabia, you have a terrible human rights record, and here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to name you and we're going to shame you. Then if they're on the committee, they can respond. So the United States gets really frustrated with that correctly. So Sudan at the height of the Darfur crisis was on the Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia with its questionable record with human rights as it relates to women elected the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and that comes to the fore in our press. Many other agencies, commissions, committees, some standing, some ad hoc, they got these regional representations or these national representations that are apportioned by region. So the 45, all of these are going to fall under that same principle that's way back here in that charter, equitable geographical distribution. It's the key. So the other way that it might play out is in leadership. So even though the Secretariat's job is to do the day-to-day work of a UN agency, the meetings themselves are run and coordinated by member states or representatives of member states. And so member states will put forward candidates for leadership who are well respected. So the 72nd General Assembly, which launched in September of 2017, its president is a representative from Slovakia. And that's considered a very big deal for Slovakia and for Western Europe to have that representative. And there's certain UN bodies that tend to have representatives from certain regions that get repeated over the course of time. So for example, the World Bank tends to have an American at its head. The IMF tends to have a West European at its head, etc. So there will be differences. Some UN bodies operate by a rotating chairmanship. The Security Council is like that. It goes in alphabetical order month by month, and whoever comes up, not the name of the ambassador, but the name of the country comes up, then they're the president for that month. So this whole complicated thing with regional representation or spots or equitable geographic distribution, however you want to say it, becomes a focus not just of national diplomacy in and around the UN, but regional diplomacy. They want the spots. Is it fair to have the decision-making of the Security Council, about 2/3 of what they do deals in some way with Africa, to not have more of an African presence? Is a question. Whereas on the other hand, a place like Japan might say, is it fair that we pay a significant portion of the money that goes to funding Security Council activities, and our region and our country doesn't have enough of a representation? These are interesting conversations about how individual nation states and how regions act and interact within the UN, and it complicates and furthers at the same time diplomacy at the UN. So national priorities combined with regional interests result in ongoing processes to gain these spots. And so what's important to one country, maybe be on UNESCO, isn't to another, and that could help them a lot.